Okay, I see more people are joining, so we are gonna wait a few more seconds and get started. Okay, so let's get started, everyone. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to UPTAKE monthly webinar series. We are very happy today to have a very great speaker and the panel here, and looking forward to having a very productive and useful conversation about CDR. At the beginning, I'm just gonna present very briefly some background information about our institute who are hosting this webinar series, and about the webinar series and the participation online. And then I will hand it over to Sonja, who will moderate the talk today. So allow me to share my screen and we get started there. Okay. So yes, so today webinar is part of this monthly webinar series that we are hosting every second Wednesday of the month at 2 p.m. Eastern Central Eastern European time. To participate, you need to register. So please follow our project. We have different platforms that I will talk a little bit about that. So you will receive emails and notification about the webinars, and you need to register to receive the link to participate here. The webinars are part of the Industrial and Planetary Carbon Cycle program at CMCC. And the CMCC organization is an Italian organization headquartered in Lecce in south of Italy. We are well represented in different locations in Italy. We have different offices and different institutes. Our activities are mainly structured through 3 institutes. We are now, I'm talking to you from Milan division, which is under the EIEE Institute, which is the European Institute for Economy and the Environment. The other institutes, as you can see in this map, they are in different locations throughout Italy and focusing on different aspects of climate change and sustainable development. We also have 3 programs, which are cross-cutting program across these divisions and institutes. The one which is hosting these seminars and webinar series today is integration of the planetary biogeochemical and industrial carbon cycle that I'm directing the program. We have also 2 other programs about global cause and prediction of socioeconomic impacts of climate change. About the project, this is also part of the Horizon project called UPTAKE project. In order to learn more about the project, you can scan this QR code and you will be redirected to a simple registration form that will allow you to join the online platform that we have created for stakeholders and members of the project. This project started in 2023 and will go until 2027. As you can see, the list of members, participants in the project, we have about 20 European partners in different fields and different locations across Europe. To participate in the conversations, meetings, and events that we are holding, the best way is to join our stakeholder forum, which is an online platform. As I mentioned, you can scan the QR code and find out more about our program. Today's talk will be about national climate strategies and the implication of them on equality and inequality of global development of carbon dioxide removals and storage. So Jennifer Roberts will be the speaker, and we have panelists Francesco Lombardi, The moderator will be Sonja. And to participate in the discussion, you need to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. You can type in your questions, and the moderator and the speaker and panelists will try to answer your question either throughout the conversation or directly type answers there. The next webinar will be on June 11 at 2 p.m. And you need to stay tuned until we announce the topic. So it's still not decided, but we will finalize it very soon. Having said that, I will hand it over now to Sonja to start the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Soleil. So good afternoon, I'm Sonja Sechi, and I work in E3M Modeling, a company based in Athens that is specialized in energy modeling at energy system at also macroeconomic level to support with science-based climate and energy policy. Today, I'm very honored to moderate today's session. But before, I would like to thank Agnieszka Boratniska and the I-Reform team for organizing this webinar, and also, of course, CMCC and Soleil to have introduced the project. And of course, thank all of you to join this webinar today and to follow in this UPTAKE discussion. We are very, very pleased today to welcome our two distinguished guests. So Jen Roberts, Senior Lecturer at the University of Strathclyde, and also Francesco Lombardi, Policy Advisor at Bellona, Europe. Before we begin, a quick note on the format. We have basically 20-25 minutes for each presentation. After both these talks, we will have we'll open the floor for question and discussion. Of course, we can also type question during the presentation, and we can also interrupt if it's needed, or just postpone to later discussion. So let me introduce briefly in the order they will speak our guests and which topics they are going to cover. Starting from Jen Roberts. She is Senior Lecturer at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and also co-founder and Deputy Director of the Strathclyde Institute for Sustainable Communities. Jen will share insights from his recent paper, very interesting, let me say in advance, because it's about how countries are committed in CO2 geological storage in their long-term energy strategy, climate and energy strategies, and how this landscape is shaping in terms of winners and losers. And also the implication of these patterns and how this direction may reinforce or challenge existing global inequalities in CDR access. Following with that, we have Francesco Lombardi, works at Bellona Europe as policy advisor. That will focus with a special focus on sustainable economic and industrial policy landscape, with a focus also on carbon pricing in Europe. In his talk, he will guide us through three main points. So an overview of the main mechanism in Europe for policy, so the European ETS and also the CBAM mechanism, how these revenues are currently used. This is very interesting topic, I think, and how can be used in particular for CDR, how they can or they cannot use for CDR, with a focus also on financing permanent CDR. So Jen, the floor is yours. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. I got there. The first step is always the tech. Thank you so much for that introduction. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jen Roberts, and I'm an UPTAKE co-investigator and lead at the University of Strathclyde here in Glasgow in Scotland. And I'm really happy to be sharing with you all today the findings of some significant research that we did over the past couple of years And I mean research by myself and my collaborators, Juan Alcalde at Geosciences Barcelona, and Gareth Johnson, previously here at Strathclyde, but now at Drax Group. All three of us are geoscientists who've been researching CO2 geological storage for over a decade, or 15 years or so in my case, working within and across different disciplines, but from a geoscience basis. So first to note, thanks Sonja for flagging this up, this work was published end of January this year, 2025, in Nature Communications, Earth and Environment. There's a lot packed into that paper. I can't go into all the details in this talk, it wouldn't be fair. So if the highlights that I share with you today pique your interest and you're interested to find out more, please do read the paper. I'll bring up the QR code and the links again at the end of the presentation. So let's start with the motivation. I want to lay out what we were interested to explore in this research, and also take the opportunity to define several acronyms that I'll be using throughout the talk. Firstly, carbon dioxide geological storage, or CGS, is considered absolutely critical for limiting dangerous climate change by mitigating fossil industrial emissions, which we here refer to as fossil CCS, and also through atmospheric carbon dioxide removal for achieving negative emissions by storing CO2 in the subsurface, so subsurface CDR, using either bioenergy with CCS, so BECCS, or direct air capture with CCS, DACs. These climate technologies that aim to permanently remove CO2 from these atmospheric carbon cycles, these technologies rely on engineered subsurface geological storage of that captured CO2. And we're talking about a lot of CO2 geological storage. Exactly how much depends on the integrated assessment climate model and the climate mitigation pathways that are used, but the numbers are significant. The figure on the right of this slide shows just how significant and also how variable. So the upper graphs are for fossil CCS in multiple different IAMs, with storage rate in gigatons per annum on the left of the graph and cumulative CO2 stored on the right. The different line colours represent the different IAMs. And the lower graphs, they show the same thing, the storage rate and the cumulative storage, but for subsurface CDR. And what these graphs show together, I don't expect you to go super into the detail, but what they show together is that to curb dangerous climate change, many, many gigatons of CO2 geological storage per year will be needed, with slightly different growth curves, but often upwards of tens of gigatons per year. I could spend 20 minutes on this slide. I'm not going to. These beautiful figures are not yet published, but they form part of ongoing work here at Strathclyde with UPTAKE research fellow Dr. Ian de Jonge Anderson. And I'm sure these slides, these images and the other things that we're looking at will feature in a future UPTAKE webinar once that work is in press. It's very exciting and ongoing, very live. So credit to Ian for these figures. But the final point I'll make on this slide is that while there are various CGS projects around the world that are in operation, with many more in the pipeline in development, it is very well accepted that the current rate of scale up is not on track to deliver what is required to meet our climate goals. So that's the first point. CGS is critical for climate. Also, the second point, substantial growth is required to meet the climate goals, and as a result, CGS is a growing market. Geological storage operators can sell capacity to CO2 capture operators, or could be contracted to offtake emissions from high carbon industries, including cross-border arrangements for international offtake. And there are various policy levers and instruments to support development and to generate revenue streams, as Francesco, our second speaker, will say more about, or to support carbon management business and to accelerate CGS uptake. And particularly since CGS kind of offers permanent storage, CGS also offers then high value credits compared to other CDR solutions. And these climate financial mechanisms will be important for supporting CGS development in terms of capacity building and project funding, and particularly in lower income countries. And there's a real case for this because not only is CGS fundamental to climate targets as part of a portfolio of climate mitigation measures, but also CGS is expected to reduce the overall economic cost of doing so, particularly if developed early. I think in this call we'll all be very familiar that rapid, early, significant emissions abatement to prevent warming now means less drastic and expensive interventions to balance the carbon books later on. So if we add into this that the current CGS knowledge economy is based in the global north and in higher income countries. Look at the countries that are developing CGS at the moment are higher income countries. And that's because CGS activity has predominantly focused on fossil CCS application to date. And indeed, regions with historic oil and gas industries are advantaged for CGS development, including material advantages such as technical data and experience, skills in supply chain, legislative frameworks, economic wealth from the resource production, but also the carbon and cost savings from the reuse of oil and gas infrastructure. So that's the status quo. And like the oil and gas production has brought economic benefit to nations, but also has contributed significantly to climate breakdown. So the question is, are these associations and advantages for CGS fair? Particularly if there'll be further future financial reward from CGS action and potentially more reward for earlier action. So these questions and associated complexities and inequalities, together with action and inaction on CGS, and the sort of emerging distribution of benefits and burdens across space and time, these are all issues that present important justice considerations, which myself and my co-authors felt both troubled by and also really intrigued by. And we wanted to explicate the status quo to be able to explore these justice dimensions further, which I'll dig into towards the end of this talk in some of the findings. But first, what did we do? The Paris Agreement invites contracting parties to submit long-term low greenhouse gas emission development strategies, LTLEDs, to the UNFCCC, outlining country-level strategies for reaching net zero. What we did is we performed a global stocktake of these by examining the presence and prevalence of CGS and differentiating fossil CCS and subsurface CDR in the decarbonisation pathways that were outlined in these LTLEDs. At the time of our study, as of the 1st of January 2024, so just about 18 months ago, there were 67 LTLEDs submitted. This has since increased to 76. I think that was yesterday I checked in on that. But we don't consider those newer submissions in our paper and in this presentation. I also wanted to explain that we didn't consider nationally determined contributions that many are more familiar with in our analysis. These outline the country level contributions through to 2030. But we felt that the time frame of 5 years was not adequate to reflect the scale up of CGS. So we focused on the LTLEDs for our work because they typically work to and beyond 2050, which is much more in line with those projections that we saw in the lovely colourful graph that Ian had produced. So we searched for the full range of possible ways to refer to CGS and its various components in the LTLEDs across the languages in which they are written, so either English, Spanish or French. We categorised countries according to their intended commitment to using CGS, whether domestically or cross-border, as shown in the blue table on the right-hand side of the slide. Those are the categories. And yeah, I just want to highlight again that we paid attention to the types of CGS when creating these categories. And we consider the results from our analyses of these LTLEDs in the context of factors outlined in this yellow table, which also sort of flags the data sources we used. So that was the current economic circumstances, the historic oil and gas production of that nation, and the CO2 storage indicator, CSI, which is a measure of a country's storage resource development that has been developed by the Global CCS Institute and has been used by many others in work like this. I do want to flag, you can see from the yellow table that we're working with incomplete data, but I touch upon this a bit later in the talk. The data gaps themselves are sometimes informative too. So what did we find? Before I jump right in, I do want to flag again that given that we're analysing against different dimensions, I don't have time to dig into all the nuances that we find in the data. Like I said, it wouldn't be fair to rush you through all that, but that's absolutely okay. My job here in this presentation is to explain key aspects, outline the key messages, and then signpost you to the paper, the data set, and the supplementary information for those eager to know more. Or keen to wrap your head around these beautiful but dense figures that are coming in the next few slides. And I want to give full credit to co-author Juan for working magic with those figures. So let's have a look first. Let's ease ourselves in with a global map. We know what we're looking at here. This is how CO2 geological storage features in the country level climate strategies, those LTLEDs. And this figure shows the geographic distribution of CGS commitment in the LTLEDs, with firm commitment in blue, possible commitment in yellow, and a complete rejection in purple. The light colour fill is where the LTLEDs are referring to fossil CCS, and the darker fill is where they are specifying subsurface CDR. And yeah, countries that have not submitted an LTLED is colourless in this figure. So without spending lots of time, let's go back a slide, on this map, I think the things I want to pull out for you, the key takeaways, is that 2/3 of the 67 LTLEDs include CGS. About half of these indicate firm commitment to using CGS as an explicit part of their climate strategy. And a further 10 include CGS in some mitigation pathways, or mention it as a possible technology, but don't commit to its use. Thought it was useful to highlight that 2 submissions consider, but then specifically disregard the use of CGS. They reject it, but they both remain open to CGS should economic conditions change. And the other third of submissions make no mention at all of CGS. And those, yeah, these are the colourless countries on this map. I also wanted to highlight for this audience that despite EU targets for CGS, of the 20 EU countries that had submitted LTLEDs, under half have got firm commitment to CGS, despite the overarching policies at an EU level. So I thought that was interesting. And so of the countries that firmly commit and plan to use CGS, just under half of those specifically mention subsurface CDR. The rest refer only to fossil CCS. And none of the LTLEDs refer to subsurface CDR alone, i.e. no emission strategies include subsurface CDR in the absence of fossil CCS. And in fact, most countries that explicitly specify a type of subsurface CDR mention BECCS, but about half mention DACs. So BECCS is more prevalent in the LTLEDs than DACs. And yeah, there's also about more mentions of CO2 utilisation in LTLEDs than subsurface CDR, so it's not a huge feature throughout these documents. So that map showed who is banking on CGS in the LTLED. So let's have a look now at how this looks with respect to economic status and historic oil and gas production. So here in this figure, we have the intended commitment towards CGS in the LTLEDs, classified on the y-axis, separated for different country income classifications on the x-axis. And the size of the circle indicates the number of countries meeting those categories. And the colour differentiates whether the country has high or low historic oil and gas production, with high in pink and low in blue. So I think it's also helpful to say when interpreting or looking at this graph, the number of Paris Agreement participants with high historic oil and gas production is pretty much comparable to those with low historic oil and gas production, about 59 and 54 respectively. So we're starting out even in that regard. So what that means is what this graph shows. These are the key takeaways for those that don't want to digest this too much further, is that the higher income countries are much more likely to have submitted LTLEDs and are much more likely to have firm commitment to CGS. By contrast, countries with high historic oil and gas production are overall much less likely to have submitted LTLEDs than countries with low historic oil and gas production. By giving an example, Nigeria was the only member of OPEC that had submitted an LTLEDs. And interestingly, I think countries with high historic oil and gas production are similarly likely to have firm commitment to CGS compared to low historic oil and gas production countries. But despite the fact that there's sort of similar levels of commitment, regardless of historic oil and gas production, no countries with high historic oil and gas production reject CGS. And only one high historic oil and gas producing nation that has submitted an LTLEDs does not mention CGS, and that's Argentina. So those are some of the trends there. If we now move to the third part of the results, which adds CO2 storage indicator into this picture, then what you have is a beautiful graph that's going to explode your mind. So I'm going to hide it. if you want to spend time with it, and I know many of you will want to, go to the paper. But I feel like if I was to keep the graph up vivid on this screen, then you wouldn't listen to the takeaway messages, because you'd be too busy trying to work out what it is. So I'm going to hide the detail and just pick out the headlines, because we just don't have time to distract you with that lovely graph. So first, it's that economic status and historic oil and gas production are linked, with high income countries much more likely to have high historic oil and gas production than low income countries, and high income countries much more likely to have a CSI, a CO2 storage indicator, and median, so much more likely to have a CSI, i.e. to know what assessment or storage capacity they have. And the median CSI increases with country income. So the further along the CSI, the higher your CSI, the more ready you are to do CGS. I should have said that before, my apologies. So all high income countries have above median CSI. So higher income countries are much more further along in terms of their readiness to develop CGS. By contrast, the assessed CSI is largely independent of economic status, but it is not independent of historic oil and gas production. The low-income countries that actually do have a CSI, so the kind of outliers, those have all received World Bank or Development Bank funding specific to CGS. So they've had supportive interventions that have helped to move them along the CSI scale. So I'd love to spend more time on that graph, but that's some of the highlights of what we found, with much more detail and interesting snippets in the paper itself. But what's really clear is that our analysis highlights these emerging inequalities and sensitivities. And it's the first time that these issues have been analysed collectively all together. So firstly, we've got the fact that higher income countries and those with high historic oil and gas production, those have contributed most to climate breakdown, okay? These are the countries that are planning on CGS, and particularly geological CDR. Of the 20 countries that refer to subsurface CDR, all but 2 of them are high income, and only the high income countries plan to develop DACs, so no low income countries are planning on DACs. So while there are corrective, climate and distributive justice arguments that, higher income or high historic oil and gas producing countries perhaps should take the responsibility or the burden of driving down technology costs and developing successful and transferable policy and legal instruments and frameworks, this maybe gets complicated if at the same time the policy and investment mechanisms to incentivise CGS, which I showed at the start is really very critical for climate action, if those mechanisms bring anticipated commercial and financial benefit, then yeah, these issues around economic justice come into play. Because in addition to CGS driving down costs of meeting national emissions reduction targets, with cost savings earlier that CGS is developed, what could happen then is that the countries that are able to maximise those cost savings are the higher income, high oil and gas producing nations. And for CGS, like I touched on at the start, there is an additional material injustice that I mentioned in terms of the subsurface data, the infrastructure, knowledge, skills, and so on, as well as the supply chain assets from the hydrocarbon sector that can be transitioned to support CGS development. And the agility that this brings places these countries at an advantage. Being or becoming CGS knowledge and technology leaders then could also exacerbate the power imbalances that are already held by hydrocarbon producing nations, which again, I'll just highlight, are not submitting LTLEDs at the same rate as lower income countries. So what could improve these positionings and potentially diffuse emerging injustices, or maybe rebalance these inequalities? I think this is a really interesting discussion point that I'd love to have with this international community, because it requires really careful, multifaceted and cross-disciplinary knowledge. But our analysis indicates a couple of things to add into that discussion. First of all, one key thing is to advance and to expand the CO2 storage indicator assessments, particularly for lower income and lower historic oil and gas producing countries. And also for countries which outline clear intent for CGS in their LTLEDs, but they don't currently have a CSI assessment, nor do they specify cross-border offtake intentions. So there's clear countries that need very specific accelerated action on the CSI assessments. And those efforts should be alongside efforts to identify country-appropriate mechanisms to increase the CSI, move it further up the scale to ensure that deployment goes in line with the LTLED's timeframes and critically climate timeframes. A second contribution that our work makes is that we join a body of work actually that's showing that the national climate policies are just not commensurate with the science. There is a mismatch between the scale of CDR proposed and the LTLEDs, and that required globally, showcasing a really clear need for greater attention on the role and purpose of CDR, and also for frameworks to ensure that subsurface CDR development is not dependent on fossil CCS or dependent on the presence of an oil and gas sector, whether that's current or historic. And I think finally, I do want to really highlight that it's very, very difficult to obtain a perspective of the expected international scale-up of CGS currently due to the quality and detail variation across the LTLEDs. So in many cases, there's a lack of detail or there's ambiguity, which makes it very difficult for us to determine consideration of or commitment to CGS. We found it wasn't possible to use the LTLEDs to identify spatial or temporal pinch points or discrepancies between capture rates, subsurface storage capacity, and other enabling factors such as transboundary policies or infrastructure or supply chain maturity, or all aspects that we're bringing into the uptake work that we're doing at Strathclyde. And so in the absence of these country level kind of scale up in the LTLEDs, it's really not possible to triangulate against fossil CCS and subsurface CDR projections modelled in the IAMs. So we are just joining a chorus of authors asking for improved LTLEDs, including further support for their development and their triangulation. So my final few words are that as well as providing kind of more granular information within the LTLEDs, there's a need for rapid improvement in standardizing and harmonizing this information. And that's going to be really critical for an integrated and coordinated effort to deliver on climate goals and to balance any inequalities. And I will flag that there has been guidance recently published by the UNFCCC to support this, but there is no mention or emphasis in that guidance on CO2 storage assessments or readiness indicators. So that's a very quick romp through aspects of our paper and aspects of our work. I've given you the headlines, but the take-home message is that inequalities and sensitivities in CO2 geological storage development must be carefully considered when designing the market and climate finance policies and frameworks for CGS development. And I guess from there, it's over to Francesco to tell us more about those instruments and hopefully to alleviate some of my concerns around here.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you. Very insightful presentation. I will leave the floor immediately to Francesco to make sure we'll stay on time.
Sure. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I will quickly share my screen and my presentation. So we should, okay, should be good. Great. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I'll try to be quick in the introduction. Thank you, Sonja, for already introducing me. My name is Francesco Lombardi. I work as a policy advisor at Bellona, Europa. And we're a climate NGO based in Brussels, focusing on industrial decarbonization. And we try to bring science and a solution-oriented approach to EU climate policy. So a little disclaimer that I am, let's say, a policy guy and not a technical guy specialized in CDR. I'm mainly focused on carbon pricing, and this is why I'm here to give this presentation. And of course, we work on CDR, carbon dioxide removals, as an organization, but my focus is more on the financial instruments that can help funding CDR. So I think when it comes to the agenda, Sonja already gave a a very good introduction, so I won't dwell too much on it. I will start with a general overview on ETS and the CBAM, so the two main carbon prices instruments present in Europe, in the European Union. The first of which is the EU ETS, or emission trading system. When it comes to carbon pricing systems, there are two main ones, which are carbon taxes and emission trading. The EU ETS is one of the first emission trading system that was implemented around the world, and as you can see from the map, many others have been implemented as well around the world, either in form of carbon tax or emission trading. In 2023, the EU ETS was reformed to align it to the objectives set out by the Green Deal, which I'm sure you're aware of because it's a big topic also in general news outlets. And this is important, and we'll go back to it later. When it comes to the ETS, it's important to know that it covers around 11,000 industrial sites, power installation, airlines, also shipping with the new reform, and it's a cap and trade system. So I will try to deep dive a little bit more into what we mean by that. So how the ETS works is it's easier than it seems. So it's a cap and trade system, which means that there is a cap on the emissions that can be released in the atmosphere, and this cap is reduced over the years. Under the ETS, one emission allowance corresponds to 1 ton of CO2, which means that installations will need to surrender a number of allowances equivalent to their emission in the past years. The allowances can be acquired either via auctions, so in the primary market, or via the secondary market, so they can be bought and sold between companies, or they can also be allocated for free. Just to give you a little idea of how it works, I am an installation, and I predict to emit a certain amount for the current year, let's say. At the end of this year, I need to surrender the number of allowances corresponding to the number of tons of CO2 equivalent that I emitted. And if I've been too optimistic in my provision, I might need to buy more allowances because I might have emitted more than I expected. But if I was too pessimistic, then I might have actually emitted less than I needed. So it means that I can sell also these allowances, and this is the trade aspect of the ETS. So this is very important because it allows for the most efficient decarbonization solution to happen first, because it makes it more convenient to emit less, basically. As I was mentioning earlier, while normally you should buy emission allowances, for most industries at risk of carbon leakage, these allowances are allocated for free. This is because it's important to protect them from the risk of carbon leakage, which is when companies that are in countries with strict climate standards relocate their production to countries with less stringent climate policies, which means that emissions might decrease from one part of the world, but they might increase on another part of the world. So to overcome this risk, some allowances were given out for free to some sectors. And this, of course, is problematic from a climate perspective because it doesn't apply the polluter pays principle, which is at the basis of the ETS, of instruments like the ETS. And here is where the CBAM comes in place. The CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and it's EU regulation, and it is the first border adjustment mechanism in place. It will be fully implemented in 2026, And from this year, EU importers will need to buy a carbon certificate corresponding to the same amount of money that a local producer would pay under the EU ETS. This means that it will level the playing field between the carbon price that is paid in the European Union and not paid abroad. It covers only 6 sectors for now, which are cement, the electricity, fertilizers, iron and steel. Anyways, you can read them in the slide, but it's open for further inclusion to more sectors. It has 2 main objectives. One of them is to ensure that free allowances are phased out under the EU ETS while protecting them from the risk of carbon leakage, because it levels the playing field between the carbon cost of EU produced goods and non-EU produced goods. But it also has, of course, an external incentive for non-EU countries to clean up their production, because, of course, if you are a producer of CBAM goods, you will be more, your product will be more competitive the greener they are. Therefore, these are the two main objectives of the CBAM. When it comes to the interaction between the CBAM and ETS, it's just important for you to know that CBAM will not start in full in 2026, but there will be a slow phase in, together with a slow phase out of free allowances that you can see from this graph. It will last until 2034, so there is still a long time to go. Despite this, it's important to know that, you know, now a lot of people are talking about the CBAM and there is a lot of fear related to the CBAM. But it's also important to know that at the beginning, CBAM will only cover the share of emissions that will be free, that will be not given for free. So as you can see, it's quite gradual. Now let's deep dive in the most, let's say, juicy part of the presentation, because last year we at Bellona, and I was the main author of this brief about the use of ETS and CBAM revenues. What we were trying to do is to kind of take stock of the situation and try to advocate and propose some recommendations on how to use revenues coming from carbon pricing. You can of course scan the QR code if you want to get more details, but I will try to deep dive into this now. So, okay, moving on. The starting point is that, okay, now the European Union will implement the CBAM. The CBAM is a new instrument. So what should we do with the revenues collected from the CBAM? Let's look at the other carbon pricing system that is already established, and this is the ETS. In the ETS, revenues coming from this instrument are mostly, for the majority, managed by member states, so the 27 member states of the European Union. Part of these revenues are also allocated through instruments such as the Innovation Fund, the Modernization Fund. And in the future, the European Union wants to create this new instrument called the Industrial Decarbonization Bank, of which we don't have many details because it's something ongoing. So this is how it works right now when it comes to the ETS. Now, the question is, when it comes to the CBAM, which is a new instrument, what should we do with the revenues? Historically, industries in the European Union called for CBAM revenues to be spent like in the European Union, especially for enhancing the competitiveness of EU industries. Most civil society organizations were calling for CBAM revenues to be located outside of the EU, especially in those countries that might be more affected by the CBAM. And Bellona, we had more of a mixed approach because we believe that it's important for CBAM revenues to be part of both EU industrial decarbonization efforts, but also that it has the potential of becoming a future platform for climate finance. And we might dwell into this maybe a little bit later, but for now, let's focus on the current situation, because the European Union decided to allocate the CBAM revenues all inside of the European Union. Specifically, 27% of them will become part of EU funding, whereas 25% of them will be allocated to the member state. This is pending the approval of member states, so it's still not decided yet, but that's the direction that the European Union has taken. Now the big question is, so what do we do with all these revenues, and how, like, why and where do we see these revenues going? So what we did was taking a look at the past. There is a clear interconnection between CBAM and ETS, and we believe that CBAM should learn from the ETS experience, and we believe that we can learn from our past mistakes to try to improve in the future. So when it comes to the ETS revenues, there was an evolution between before the reform that I talked about earlier and after the reform. Now member states are binded to spend 100% of revenues to climate action, whereas before they were recommended to spend at least 50% of revenues towards climate action. The problem is that even though now it's binding to spend 100% revenues into climate action, which we believe is great, there is still a problem because there are three pitfalls that we identified in the report. The first one is that there are exceptions. So 25% of revenues can be used to cover CO2 carbon compensation, which I will not get into the details of it, but basically they are subsidies for energy and also fossil energy. So it's definitely, we don't consider it as climate action. The spending categories are very broad. They are vague, and they don't tackle enough the problem that we're facing now when it comes to climate change. And thirdly, there is a very weak reporting. Therefore, member states are not held accountable if they mismanage these revenues. So looking a little bit more in details on 22 figures, you can see here that even though we didn't do a specific analysis of each member state and how they've been used, we only focus on how they claim to have used these revenues. We noticed that there were some member states that performed really poorly. You can see, for example, Belgium and the Netherlands especially performed very poorly. You can see them here. They collected a lot of revenues, but they didn't spend many on climate action. Secondly, we calculated that the revenues not spent into climate action amounted to more than 11 billion euros, which of course it's a lot of money, as you can imagine, especially when we're facing the climate crisis that we're facing now. And third of all, there was some curious data about, Cyprus, for example, or Croatia, that they claimed to have spent more revenues than they actually collected, which means that member states are not really serious when declaring how they spend these revenues. This was what happened, let's say, in the European Union. Just looking beyond the European Union, it's very important to know that CBAM has also this kind of external and international aspect, and therefore it's very important for us, for the European Union, to take into account this. There's been a lot of international criticism following CBAM, especially when it comes to WTO compliance. It was considered as a protectionist measure, especially for global South countries. And CBAM might be actually an opportunity. So we really need to take this into account. Now, when it comes to how to spend carbon pricing revenues, Bellona brought forward the three main recommendations, which I'm going to explain now. The first one is that when it comes to carbon pricing revenues, either CBAM and ETS, all revenues should be allocated towards climate action in a transparent and accountable way. This means that there shouldn't be exceptions, and that there should be accountability for whoever spends these revenues to spend them actually into climate action. Moreover, when it comes to industrial decarbonization or emission reductions or removals, We believe that these revenues, the project funded by these revenues need to be designed in a credible way without room for greenwashing. And we identified 4 criteria that I'm going to explain right after. And another point that we also think it's important, also in the context of more social justice, is that we believe that because of the international effect, that the international spillover effect that CBAM has, it's very important to allocate these revenues also internationally, especially with a focus on the sectors covered by the CBAM. Now, this is the last slide, and maybe that's the most relevant one because it's focused on CDR. I say I have 5 minutes left, and Sonja, let me know if we're okay with time.
We can close.
Yeah. So when it comes to financing CDR, of course, we realize that the discussion is a bit immature. So what we believe it's necessary is to get the projects on the ground and see whether they work. And we believe that we need to distinguish between the short term and the long term. So in the long term, we might think about a market-based system that might help developing CDR projects. But when it comes to the short term, we believe that public money and especially carbon pricing revenues might play a role. What we see as clear, though, is not where we should spend this money, but how we should spend this money. And this is why these 4 criteria come into action. And we really believe that this criteria needs to be followed. So these 4 criteria, you can see them there, are climate impact, system effect, timing, and scalability that do no significant harm. When it comes to the CDR, especially engineered CDR, we think that that CDR will have a role in the fight of climate change, but we also think that it's important to limit this role only to emissions that will be hard to abate in with other means, with other means of decarbonization. And we also believe that whenever we are developing a CDR project, this needs to be done taking into account the climate impact of the overall project, which means that, for example, if we're talking about ducts, they would need to be powered by renewable energy, and this means, though, that they cannot cannibalize renewable energy. So it cannot be that in order to power a duct plant, for example, you are then increasing emission elsewhere in the system because there is lack of renewable. So we really believe that additionality, for example, it's a very important principle. And when it comes to time and scalability, of course, all the climate action needs to be scalable in a timely manner, consistent with the EU climate targets of 2050. And we also believe that this project cannot harm the environment. Therefore, they should apply the no significant harm principle. I think I can stop here from what it regards with CDR. Of course, I'm open to the discussion. Just quickly mention that you can either get in touch with me or my colleague Mark, who is more expert on CDR. And thank you very much for listening in.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you very much. Now there were some questions already asked in the chat, also answered by Jennifer. Just to mention, one was about how the long-term climate strategies are, I mean, if they are enough to respect the 1.5 scenario. And basically, Jen, I don't know if you want to add something, but basically the problem, you are asked the problem of ambiguity of these strategies. So it's necessary some harmonization in terms of reporting at target years. Also, there was a question about the fact that these technologies can be very high energy intensive. And of course, Francesco now mentioned this because, of course, it's the focus point. I think it's the prioritization of these technologies. There was, a question I already answered, but maybe it's important to avoid confusion because one person asked something about how the free allowances basically works. There is a price for allowances. I start answer that there is some free allocated allowances for each sector. This is because it's the mechanism is gradually. So basically, for a lot of years, sector energy, also energy intensive sector, has not paid anything, and now this share is decreasing. But maybe Francesco, you can highlight even better. I mean, even more what you mentioned also about CBAM, because you mentioned that the people fear about this mechanism, but it's also gradually. So maybe you can highlight which is the link about the ETS system and free allowances and the new CBAM. Maybe you mentioned this, but since some people have some confusion, it's important.
Of course, thank you very much for giving me the possibility of clarifying. I'll be very quick. Yeah, so basically, allowances are given in two main ways. Either you buy them or they are given to you for free. But so some specific sector, as Sonja well said, receive free allowances. So they receive these allowances for free. They don't need to pay for them, and this is to protect them from the risk of having too much of a costly production and therefore risking to relocate their industry. Now, starting from 2026. Some of these sectors, not all of them, some of these sectors, the ones that are covered by CBAM, which are iron and steel, aluminium, hydrogen, electricity, fertilizers, and cement, will start paying for these free allowances, will start paying for allowances gradually. So the amount of free allowances that they receive will decrease. But at the same time, they will be protected by the CBAM, which basically makes an importer pay the same amount when they import goods of carbon price that a EU producer would pay inside. And this will level the playing field between what happens in the European Union and what happens in the rest of the world, mitigating the risk of carbon leakage.
Thank you. Very clear. I hope the audience is happy about this. There is some other question from the audience.
It's around the permanence in that kind of what to fund, I think, around those priorities that Francesco laid out. Francesco, I absolutely love that work that you've done examining and evaluating who's doing well. And I guess I can respond a little bit to one of the questions I answered around, we just don't at the moment have the granularity in the LTLEDs to be able to really triangulate to say who, are we on track collectively internationally? What we could do is start going and identifying which countries are being very helpful in their LTLEDs and very specific, and hold them up as an example or an exemplar. But actually, these LTLEDs are working documents, so they are expected to evolve and to update and so on. But I think that work that you've done showing who's spending what, who's kind of doing good, is important, and highlighting then that, if we're moving towards binding type agreements, then I guess that's where in law, international law, and comes it. So there's now a stick if people or countries don't choose to invest in the ways that you're outlining.
Yes, and I think to complement on this, I think it was very interesting what you said about the coordinated efforts, which is very important because, for example, in the European Union, we know that we have quite stringent policies, but that's not the case in the rest of the world. And when it comes to EU 2030 targets, for example, there is a lot of media is talking about including international carbon credits to kind of offset European emission. And we see that that's potentially problematic because, of course, we believe that the European Union should develop their own, carbon removals project. But when it comes to offsetting emission, we are really aware of the risk of mitigation deterrence. So it's really important also to take into account this coordination among countries to ensure that this is done, but this is done in a way that doesn't allow, emitters to still emitting and just buy carbon credits.
Thank you very much. I think maybe a very last question for Francesco and one quick question for Jenna. So yeah, I mean, if there are no any questions from the audience, because I cannot see now, but maybe yes. So what can you say about possibilities to include the commodity agri-production under mechanism CBAM? I don't know if You have an opinion on this?
No. Now the Commission is expanding CIMA to downstream products, and I think someone asked semi-finished products. Yes, this is under evaluation. It will probably happen for some sectors specifically. I know iron and steel sector. When it comes to agri-production, well, actually, yes, some chemicals might be included in CBAM. But unfortunately, CBAM, it's a very fascinating but complicated topic. So we would need, I think, a whole webinar to answer this question. And I'm happy, please reach out to me.
Yeah.
The email is francesco@bellona.org. So if you have specific questions, I'm more than happy to reply. And I'm happy to see interest in these topics.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to type other questions, please let us know so we can forward to Francesco and Jen. So I think we are in time. Just a quick question to Jen about, the supplementary material that is, this database that she created for the paper that I think it's very valuable also for this project. So my question is, you mentioned a bit during the presentation, but how you think to expand this, to keep update? There is a plan, so.
Yeah, I think we want to see what, because this is the difficulty with these living documents is that they will be evolving. Some of the ones that we analysed previously have since been updated. I think whilst the UPTAKE project is ongoing, we can continue to keep some materials up to date, but I think more generally there'll be a need for this regular stock take on how things are progressing, and particularly with these interventions, these policy instruments, to see where movement is going. I think a really key aspect to the work going forward, thank you for highlighting the supplementary data. There's a lot more in that than we actually present in the paper itself, including the wording that countries use, but really key will be supportive interventions that I probably didn't speak so much about in the presentation to help countries to move forward with, to progress with their CO2 storage indicators. And I think that's going to be really interesting to see how that evolves as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we can close. There are some questions technically, so yeah, we mentioned the stakeholder forum, so the webinar will be published, so will be available for everybody. So thank you very much all for attending. Also Jen and Francesco for this very brilliant presentation. So have a good afternoon.